My name is Dr. Amin Davoodi. I'm an assistant professor of bilingual and ESL education here at the University of Texas Permian Basin, which is located in West Texas in Odessa. And we are so excited today to have Professor Noam Chomsky as our guest speaker. So more than 2,225 people have registered for the event from more than 110 countries in the world. So I'm not going to mention the names of all countries, but basically we have people from all around the world. And generally, I can say the audience that we have today, so most of them are faculty members, teachers, researchers, students in either linguistics and education, sociology, or political science. So obviously we have, people from other disciplines, but the majority of our, participants are either in education and linguistics, sociology, and political science. So I would like to thank you, Professor Chomsky, for giving us your time. Without further ado, and without any introduction, because obviously you don't need any introduction. So I'm going to ask you the first question. And by the way, for our audience, please, if you want to ask questions, please use that Q&A option. It makes it easier for me. So the first question, which is a general question, like an introductory question, is basically, I want to get your thoughts on what's going on in the world in terms of education as well as sociopolitical unrests. And, a lot of researchers and a lot of people who write about sociopolitical issues as well as linguistic issues, they argue that the future of education is going to be way different. So I want to get your thoughts on that. How do you think education will be affected and will affect our society in the near future, considering the fact that still there are wars going on in the world? We have, a lot of crises in the Middle East, in Europe, sociopolitical unrest. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that and how you think we as educators, we can help the society when it comes to training and teaching our students.
Well, the fundamental issues of the nature of education were raised and discussed during the Enlightenment, and it's still pretty much the same issues. So if you go back to the 18th century, period of the Enlightenment, there was much discussion about the nature of education. And basically two models were counterposed. They're presented by vivid imagery. So one model was that of a vessel into which you pour water, and then the vessel pours the water out at a certain point. That's what we now call teaching to test. You pour water into the student's mind, and the student lets it out at a certain time in the test. We've all had experiences with this. We've taken courses that we had no interest in, learned what you had to learn, passed the test, poured the water out of the vessel. 2 weeks later, we forgot what the course was about. I'm sure you've all had that experience. I have. That's the model of, this was ridiculed in the 18th century. Today, on the other hand, it's recognized as the dominant feature of our educational system, teaching to test. There was another model proposed, an alternative. It was proposed, for example, by Wilhelm von Humboldt, leading humanist Enlightenment figure, one of the founders of classical liberalism, also the founder of the modern research university. His image was that education should be like laying out a string along which the student progresses in his or her own way. The image is meant to suggest that the role of the instructor is to provide a certain general structure and then encourage the students to inquire, create in their own way, abilities for critical analysis, intelligence, and innovation, interacting with the instructor, they may, in fact, famous progressive educator Paulo Freire, Brazilian in the 20th century, argued that education should even be an interactive process. So the string may be moved by the initiatives of and creativity of the students. And that's the second kind of education. It was developed by John Dewey in the United States, by other progressive educators. It's pretty much fallen by the wayside in the modern period. But I figured that this is the kind of education that we should try to nurture and develop. It's particularly significant right now for the reasons you mentioned. We happen to be living at a unique moment in human history. There's never been anything like it. And unless we answer the questions that are arising the right way, there will never be anything like it again, because organized human society will disappear. We're on the cusp of that decision. We're marching towards a precipice. We moved several domains, two major ones. Actually, there are three major ones. You get a good sense of this by looking at the famous doomsday clock of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Every January, a group of scientists, political analysts, try to assess the world situation and to set the hands of the clock a certain distance from midnight. Midnight means termination. Human experiment is over. So how far are we from midnight? Well, the clock was first set after the atomic bombs were dropped, 1947. Then it was 7 minutes to midnight. 1953, it moved to 2 minutes to midnight because the United States and the Soviet Union had exploded thermonuclear weapons. That meant that human intelligence had reached the point where humans were able to destroy everything. You can say rose to that point or sank to that point, depending on how you look at it. Since then, the hands of the clock have oscillated depending on the world situation. It never reached 2 minutes again until the Trump administration. At that point, the clock was moved to 2 minutes to midnight. Since then, it's been advanced closer. 2 years ago, the analysts abandoned minutes, shifted to seconds. It's now set at 100 seconds to midnight. It's coming January, probably be moved closer. They identify three major issues. One is the growing threat of nuclear war, and it is growing right now, both in Europe and in Asia. Second one is destruction of the environment, recognition that we are not dealing with it. In fact, we are making it worse. Second issue. Third issue is the collapse of functioning democracy, the disappearance of an arena of rational debate and discussion. Now, it may sound as if that doesn't belong with the first two, but it does, because it's only if that arena of debate and discussion is alive and functioning that we'll be able to deal with the critical crises, which are reaching a terminal point. Well, now we're back to your question. It's education that can create and sustain and nourish that arena of discussion and debate by fostering critical intelligence, willingness to evaluate arguments and evidence, sympathetic concern for other opinions, their flaws and their contributions. That's what makes a democracy a functional system. Unless we can recover that, we will march on to disaster. We will cross the precipice. It's as simple as that. And the Permian Basin, for reasons too obvious to mention, is right at the heart of this discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your answer. So going back to what you mentioned about Paulo Freire and kind of the idea of educating children indirectly, I would like to ask you a question on banking model of education. Do you think it still exists in our society, in the world? And I assume that the answer is yes. And if that is the case, how do you see the role of the internet, technology, and social media, closing the gap and providing opportunities for children, even in countries with oppressive regimes, to kind of get that indirect education, not from their government, but from the free world?
Yesterday, one of my many talks and discussions happened to be in Iran. This discussion on issues of philosophy and education and science. The discussion was regularly interrupted by the closing of the internet, which is a very on and off matter in a highly repressive authoritarian society, now incidentally undergoing a remarkable, astonishing popular revolution led mostly by young women, which is quite amazing in an Islamic society. Bringing in huge numbers of people may shake the regime. Well, that's the kind of thing that happens in an authoritarian society. How does it work in our society? Well, not that way. Like you and I are not going to be dragged off to a prison cell by challenging received opinion. But there are other ways to control opinion. One of them, which has been developed to a very high level of sophistication in the more democratic societies, is to create a spectrum of discussion and debate. It's what you see in the mainstream media, intellectual life, scholarship. There's a spectrum within which you're allowed to have, encouraged, in fact, to have lively discussion. But the bounds are strictly set. If you go beyond that spectrum, you're out. Now, we see that right at the moment. We see it all the time, but take right now. There's a critical issue on Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There are basically two positions. One position is the US government position, official position, which says the war must continue in order to severely weaken Russia. No negotiations. Second position is we have to move quickly towards negotiations and diplomacy in order to stop the horrors that are underway and to prevent their possible escalation to terminal nuclear war, and to end the fact that they are reversing. As long as the war goes on, it reverses the limited efforts to deal with the existential crisis of climate destruction, pours resources into maximizing the destruction, and cuts off efforts to deal with it. Those are the two positions. one of those two positions totally dominates discourse. If anyone in the United States suggests now is the time for negotiation and diplomacy, they're either ignored or vilified or demonized. Even people as respected in the mainstream as Henry Kissinger. Appeasement, Munich, communist sympathizer, all kind of, well, that's the way you keep discussion bounded. So you can have a discussion about the tactics. Should we send this kind of weapon or that kind of weapon? Should we institute a no-fly zone or not? But virtually nothing, except way at the margins, about the move towards diplomacy, negotiations in order to achieve the goals I mentioned. Now that's the United States. It's not the world, but we're not told about the world. In the world, overwhelmingly, all through the South, former third world, the overwhelming majority does not take part in what they see as a war between two European powers. They don't take part and they don't support our position. If you move to Europe, pretty much the same. So in Germany, center of Europe, 3/4 of the population want to move to negotiations right now. Same in other places. US is immune. Never hear about this. In fact, what you do hear is often just fabrication. I can give you examples. Well, that system of encouraging lively debate within fixed bounds turns out to be a very effective technique of propaganda. Now, going back to the internet, in a totalitarian state, you can close it down. During the Arab Spring, for example, another remarkable popular uprising a decade ago, the repressive governments like Egypt closed down the internet. The popular movements increased in their activism just through other means of interaction, personal otherwise. In a more democratic society, you leave it open, but impose fixed boundaries. Now, it's impossible to do this by force, but you can do it by conformity and complicity. Well, let's take a look now at the internet. You mentioned that the internet provides enormous opportunities. Are those opportunities used? So, for example, I like to be concrete. There's been great euphoria in establishment circles over the claim that India, huge major country, has separated itself from Russia and has condemned the invasion. Big victory for the United States. Take a look and you find that this is based on 6 words. At a meeting between Prime Minister Modi of India and Vladimir Putin in Samarkand, Modi began the discussion by saying, "War is not the way." Those are the 6 words that enter US media, discussion, debate, and so on. Well, we have access to the internet. Therefore, it is possible for everyone to do what I did. It's easy. Click look up the Indian government official website and see what Modi actually said. Turns out he said the opposite. He said, India is with you. Our bonds are unbreakable. We'll make them closer and closer. We'll all work together to bring about a more peaceful and just world. Exactly the opposite of what was reported. Well, the internet provides that opportunity. Do we use it? Almost nobody. What we do is turn to our favorite sites, which reinforce our own views and cut off alternative views. We undermine the possibilities of the internet for enlightenment and opportunity and rational debate. So the internet is like most technology. It's basically neutral. So take a hammer. A hammer can be used to build a house, can be used by a torturer to crush someone's skull. Now, the hammer doesn't care. It's we who make the decisions. And it's the same with the internet. We can turn the internet into a system of enlightenment, activism, engagement, rational discussion, dealing with the problems, the existential problems we have, or we can decide to use it as a way of driving us into bubbles where we don't hear each other. It's our choice. The internet doesn't care.
Okay, thank you so much. And by the way, as a Kurdish Iranian, I just wanted to thank you for your support for the people of Iran. So next question comes from my colleagues in the literacy program that we have here. We would like to get your thoughts on the idea of independent reading for children in a school and the idea of book of choice.
Well, I think depends what our goals in education are. Back to the original comment. Do we have the model of a vessel into which we pour water and then the student lets some of it go? If you assign readings, that's what you're doing. You're saying, here's what you have to know, learn this, answer some questions in a test, and then you're on your own. Maybe forget you took the course. If students have the initiative to look for reading on their own, that should be encouraged. Maybe they'll pick something that the teacher recognizes is not the best thing for their needs. Fine, then let them discover it. Lay out the string. Encourage them to go in a direction which will lead to flourishing of engagement, inquiry, creativity, but then let them go their own way. We learn from our mistakes. We know that. And we learn from our achievements. That way you develop an inquiring mind, open to new ideas, searching to find better ways, not just conforming and repeating to what the establishment demands. Let me just mention some personal experiences. In the United States in this century, Bush administration, Obama administration, the educational system, K-12, has been shifted substantially to the pouring water into a vessel model, teaching to test. I've had experiences where I gave talks to teachers, and a sixth grade teacher would come up to me saying, it's all well and good to talk about what you're talking about, but I have my job to keep. If a child comes up to me after a class and says, I was interested in what you said about this. Can you suggest something I can look at to find more about it? I have to tell that child, sorry, you can't do that. You have to study to pass this test. It was in Massachusetts I was living, so the MCAS. I have to pass the MCAS. Your future depends on it. Teacher didn't say it, but in the back of her mind is my salary depends on it, my job. Well, my view, that's the worst kind of education. It's the kind that imposes conformity, obedience, refusal, for example, unwillingness, not even refusal, not even thinking about using the opportunities that the internet gives you. So yes, I mean, there are bounds. You don't want to let the student just go off in some crazy direction. That's what it means to lay out the string. But to encourage innovation, creativity, independent reading within this framework, I think is exactly the right thing to do. Just my own personal experience, if that matters. My education was mainly in libraries and in bookstores. I was lucky in college to be given Harvard, to be given a desk in the Widener Library, amazing library. And just being able to walk around the stacks of the library, pick out books on this or that subject, pursue them if they were interesting. It's a kind of education you can't get in classrooms.
Okay, thank you. So the next question comes from my program area. So I'm going to ask this on behalf of Dr. Salgado, our bilingual program coordinator, and myself. So it's about bilingual education. So we know that in many different countries, including the United States, there are a lot of people who still do not believe in bilingual education, and they don't see a point in like raising multilingual children. I've been asked by many friends why I'm trying to raise my children learning, Persian, Kurdish, and English, and hopefully Spanish, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that. And we had the same discussion with Professor Stephen Krashen, and he has a book in which he refers to bilingual education as something that has been condemned without trial. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that and tell us why a lot of people are against bilingual education.
Well, the United States happens to be an unusual country. If you're living in Europe, travel 100 miles, people are speaking a different language. A fair amount of multilingual character. If you live in West Africa, you grow up in many places speaking half a dozen languages. And young children don't even know it. What they know is, this is the way I talk to my mother. This is the way I talk to my grandfather. This is the way I talk to the kids in the street, and so on. A child just soaks up languages like a sponge, greatly enriches their lives. Even if they don't use the languages, just knowing the kinds of cultural wealth that's embedded in them, framework of oral history, modes of thinking, these greatly enriches your life. Well, miles from Boston to Los Angeles and think you're in the same place you started from. Slightly different accent, maybe. Same people, same language, same stores, and so on. Why bother? It's not just the United States. Yesterday, I happened to have one of the many Iran. I happen to be in China. And there's a movement among Chinese educators to stop teaching English because they think that with the use of Google Translate, it eliminates the need to know English. And that's a bad joke. I mean, I use Google Translate for a language that I don't know to get the rough idea of what an article is about. But if you want to understand it, that's not going to work. You want to really understand it, you got to know the language, understand it. You have to get a skilled translator or else learn it yourself. Well, we're deprived if we don't have those experiences. We should have them. Children relish them. I'm sure you found that with your own children. It's fine to talk 2 different languages, 3 different languages. Exciting, In fact, I don't know about your experience, but quite commonly, until children are about 4 or 5 years old, they're not even aware they're speaking different languages. When they speak it, it's a aha-erlebnis, amazing insight. Hey, look how rich and complex the world is. Why deprive children of this?
Thank you so much. So Dr. Salgado has a follow-up question. We have a lot of teachers in the state of Texas and across the US that are not ESL certified, or they are not bilingual teachers. However, they deal with bilingual and ESL students on a daily basis. So do you have any piece of advice? How can those mainstream teachers support English language learners in their classrooms?
Well, I mean, I think we all know the answers. With sympathy, understanding, support, developing as much as you can. First of all, it doesn't take much to have a child in class who doesn't know English to enable the child to become part of the English-speaking environment. Tell you another personal anecdote, if you like. But my family and I went to Italy about 40 years ago. I was teaching in Pisa at the Scuola Normale, the big research university in Pisa. My wife and I, one of our daughters, who was 20 years old, wanted to learn Italian. So we were studying, working on Italian, had teachers and so on. I had a 10-year-old son. He didn't want to go to Italy in the worst way. Didn't want to be in a foreign country, didn't want to lose his friends. He told us, I'm not going to learn Italian. I don't care what you want. Well, we sent him to an Italian school. About a month later, if the telephone rang, he had to answer it because he was the only person who could speak fluent Italian. He couldn't help it. You're in an environment where kids are talking Italian, you're going to talk Italian. Maybe you don't want to, but you're going to do it anyway. This is, as I say, children just pick it up like a sponge. They can't help it. It's reflexive. That is advice to teachers. Just integrate the children into the environment, interacting with others. Nature will take its course. From the teacher, what's required is sympathy, motivation, encouragement, direction, a certain degree of direction, but almost, I think all teachers know this, 90% of what matters is motivation and engagement. If you have that, your methods can make a difference, but there are differences at the margins.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your response. So this lecture series is sponsored by the College of Education at the University of Texas Permian Basin. So here at the College of Education, we always try to recruit more students because we know that the state of Texas, especially the Permian Basin, we need more teachers, you know. Teacher shortage is a huge problem, especially in this area, in all fields, especially bilingual education. So Professor Chomsky, my question is, do we have to wait and negotiate with politicians, with, you know, officials to kind of help us motivate more high school students, more college students to get into the field of education? I personally don't like that because I think they don't listen to us, and I'm always interested in having a bottom-up approach. So if that is the case, how do you think we as education professors, teachers, trainers can motivate more students to get into the field of education so that we can fight this crisis that we have in, you know, and it is even worse after the pandemic?
Well, there's several ways. I should say there's no big secrets here, but there are several ways. One is just encourage students to press for these educational programs. So again, let me give a personal anecdote. I spent most of my teaching life at MIT, greatest science engineering school in the world, probably. When I got there, it was an engineering school. There was no humanities programs. A few things, just teach the most limited things you can imagine. In fact, I initiated the first philosophy program, linguistic program, then a psychology program, and others. A couple of years later, 1950s, students were pressing for more humanities and arts. That's what they wanted. There was enough pressure on the university, so it did develop very sophisticated, advanced programs in these areas. Now it's not an engineering school anymore. It's a university based on science, but with very rich, advanced programs in many areas. It came out of student pressure. Of course, the students were encouraged. They weren't just told, shut up and do your work, pass your test. They weren't told that. I said, okay, you want a philosophy course? Let's start a philosophy course. Let's invite somebody to teach it and so on. Gradually grew from there. That's one way. The other way is directly with the politicians. I don't know if this is happening in Texas, but take what's happened in recent years in West Virginia and Arizona. I live in Arizona, so I've seen it firsthand. There's been a remarkable growth of activism of teachers, organizing, demanding that the legislatures provide students with decent educational opportunities. Under the right-wing administrations, education has been sharply cut back. The Republican Party is almost openly saying we're opposed to public education. Funding's been cut back. Teacher salaries are much too low. Classrooms are much too big. Teaching becomes just trying to keep order in the classroom. Well, the teachers are organized to oppose that. Big demonstrations, organizing in the communities. Walk around the town where I live, Tucson, Arizona, signs on lawns, red for ed, let's support the teachers. The past referenda, calling for decent expenses, funding for students. Right-wing legislature blocks them, but if you keep working on it, you can achieve it. Takes popular organization, commitment. There's lots of things that can be done. Let me give you another example. There's many, but here's a real one. In the town where I live, Tucson, there's a large Mexican-American community. I think almost half the population. And most of them are recent immigrants, poor, live in sections of the city that are severely impoverished. Well, there was a school right in these areas, which was a kind of school where the main educational program is to keep the kids from hitting each other, literally. Overcrowded classrooms, poor families, no support at home. Students come into class, hadn't had breakfast, they're rambunctious, and so on. There were a couple of people, some from the university, some from the community, who tried an experiment. They established a small garden in the school, got the kids interested in watering the plants, seeing them grow, doing something together. Pretty soon they introduced fish. And the students became interested in how the excrement of the fish could be used to fertilize the garden. Well, without going on, by now, when you go to the school, you're greeted by a couple of 10-year-old kids who take you through this elaborate system that they've developed, explain the Bible into a class, orderly. Kids are studying, kids are going to college for the first time. You can, and the community got organized. Community is people who were 1 or 2 generations back, they were campesinos. They understand about farming. They got interested. Students would sell fruit and cheap vegetables and fruit in the community. People from the community would come in to help out with their own background. Pretty soon you had a lively community working. These are all things that can be done. There are lots of things like them. They don't happen by themselves. But when you ask, what can we do? Lots of things. With all the problems in the country, it remains a very free country. Like I said, you're not going to be carted off and sent to a concentration camp. It's not the Kurds in Iran. It's so we can make use of those opportunities. We have the opportunities. Some people, like the teachers in West Virginia and Arizona, are making use of them. The people who built this school and community in South Tucson, they're making use of them. We can all do it in our own ways, and it can make a very different country.
Thank you so much. So just on a side note, I have received more than 50 different questions, and there is no way that I can ask all of your questions. I just wanted to let you know that I do my best to ask a variety of questions. So we've got some questions which are about your theory of universal grammar. And I'm going to link that to another question that I received about the field of English language learning, going to the extremes, teach grammar, don't teach grammar. So how do you see the role of grammar in language learning? And also, how do you see universal grammar when it comes to new approaches to language learning, like constructive approach or communicative language teaching?
Well, when we turn to universal grammar, we're moving into another domain, the domain of trying to understand what kind of creatures humans are. Human beings are very special creatures. There's nothing like them in the rest of the organic world. Biologists often say there's the world of organic creatures and then there's humans, just radically different. We here are having this discussion. My dogs are quite intelligent. They can't be having it. I live in the desert. The ants and desert ants in my backyard have brains the size of a grass seed or less. They can carry out amazing computations in navigation and communication that humans can't duplicate without elaborate instruments. So it's not a matter of more or less, but they can't do what we're doing. They can't think, they can't reflect, they can't reason, evaluate, make plans, the kinds of things we all do all our lives. Well, why can humans do this? 2 properties. 1, humans have language. All of this is done in language. Second is thought, these capacities that we're exercising. Now, there is a tradition, a rich tradition, goes back to classical Greece, classical India, which holds that language and thought are fundamentally the same thing. Language is what generates thought. Thought is what is generated by language. That tradition lasted into the 20th century. In the 20th century, it was beaten down by behaviorism, structuralism, other 20th century doctrines, and it was forgotten. It's now being revived, and there's every indication that it was correct. This capacity to have language and thought is a species property of humans. it's common to all humans. As far as we know, there's no differences. Any child can be brought up in any culture and acquire the language and the culture reflexively. That's true if it's a tribe in Papua New Guinea that hasn't had human contact for 30,000 years. As far as we know, they're the same as us. So it's a species property common to humans, has no analogs anywhere else in the animal world. There's a lot of mythology about this, but if you look closely, the basic features are unique to humans. So what is it that takes a human infant, put it in the same environment as a chimpanzee infant? They have pretty much the same auditory system, pretty much the same perceptual system. The human infant will reflexively acquire language very quickly on the basis of very little experience, pretty much the way the child grows. You know, the chimp will hear nothing but noise. And no matter how much training you try, can't break the chimp out. Now, the name for that property is called universal grammar. So it's got to be there. And the problem is, what is it? What's the nature of this system that's implanted in the child's mind that enables them to learn the meanings of words, to acquire sentence structure, to carry out the activities that we normally carry out? There's a good deal of work on this. A lot of understanding developed about it. It's considered controversial, but that's just a confusion. Can't be controversial. There has to be some innate property of humans, universal grammar is the technical name for it, that enables the child, but no other organism, to reflexively acquire this capacity on the basis of little evidence. Problem is to find out what it is. We learned about it. Well, that was the first question. I've forgotten what the second part of the question was. Did you repeat what the second part was?
That's okay. You just covered the question, and I appreciate that. So there's one question on the role of teaching culture in classroom, especially when the student population is diverse. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you see that it is relevant to include cultural elements in classrooms, like mainstream classrooms? And if yes, how can teachers make a balance between what they are required to teach, in terms of the curriculum and everything, and what they would like to contribute to the cultural awareness of their students, if that is not something supported by their school district?
Well, it's a problem that teachers face. I mentioned the case of the 6th grade teacher who was unable to allow a little girl to pursue her interests because she had to pass the MCAS exam. Teachers are faced with that. If you have a culturally diverse classroom, offers a tremendous opportunity for children to enrich their lives and understanding by gaining comprehension, some degree of immersion in other cultures with their own wealth, contributions, perspectives, and so on. It's a remarkable opportunity. Maybe that the rigidity of the curriculum imposed from above blocks the opportunity to pursue these, to develop these possibilities. That's something the teacher has to balance. There's no single answer to it. It's what we should be doing is moving to eliminate these constraints so teachers can adjust as the situation requires. It's the teacher's judgment to see to what extent you can pursue these opportunities, to what extent you have to keep to a framework that is necessary to move on to the next step. There's no simple answer to that. It's a matter of judgment, understanding, sympathy, seeing where your students are, where they come from, and so on. And a lot can be done. I'll just give you one other example of what can be done. There's a close friend of mine who's a very good scientist, a leading cognitive scientist, who got interested in Massachusetts. This was a pretty liberal state with fairly advanced programs by comparative standards. Well, there are children who are considered just hopeless. You can't manage them in a classroom. They just have tantrums, they go wild, they won't obey, they start screaming, they insult the teacher. Now they're put in special facilities. This, my friend decided to try something else. He took these students, he looked into their backgrounds. A lot of them were kids who were coming from dysfunctional families. Kid wakes up in the morning, mother yells at him, doesn't get breakfast, is put on a school bus, and travels for an hour, gets to school, he's going crazy, put in a math class, he doesn't want to do anything. Well, what my friend did was do it differently. Take these kids, when they come to school, first of all, give them sweets, candies, because they have low levels of glucose. They're low energy, they haven't had good nutrition or sympathy. Then let them have some free time, which they can act out. When they've done it, bring them into the classroom, let them use their initiative, the kinds of methods we've talked about. He's pursued this with some of the areas in Massachusetts where these schools were just at prisons, basically. By now, they're getting the best test results in Massachusetts. The kids are not lost. You can deprive them, but you can also nurture their own capacities, let them find their way out. It can be done. He's got an interesting book about it, just came out, called Vulnerable Minds. It's coming out pretty soon, which discusses all of this in some detail. But it's been a pretty amazing achievement.
Okay, thank you so much. And I would like to ask you a question about language learning and adults. So I've got some questions about that. So some of the questions are based on the critical, period hypothesis. But basically, I wanted to get your thoughts on how adults can learn languages, and basically, if you have any recommendations. So I got a lot of questions similar to this one. They want to get your thoughts on language learning for adults.
Well, I think the evidence for critical periods is quite strong, several of them. Major one, roughly around puberty. Pre-puberty, children just seem to pick up languages effortlessly. It's like reflexive. Post-puberty tends to be a bit of a struggle, ordinarily. There are, I should say, individual differences. I've known adults who learn languages like children, yes, but that's very, very rare. Most of us have to work on it. And the most important matter, as usual, is motivation. Do you want to do it? Immersion is better than reading a book. We all know that. But overall, the question is, how committed are you to do it? And it's not impossible by any means. I hope you don't mind personal anecdotes, but the anecdotes are typical of what's going on in the world. So about 30 years ago, I went to an international conference in Sweden. The conference was pretty boring as usual, so I left and walked out in the streets and managed to get lost in Stockholm. tried to find my way back, but couldn't find anybody who spoke English. So I finally managed to communicate with people in broken German, which they could more or less understand and I could more or less produce. And I finally got back to my hotel. You walk on the streets of Stockholm now, everybody speaks perfect English. You can't find anybody who doesn't. No genetic difference, just differences in interest and motivation. Makes a richer society. It doesn't have to be English. Could be in whatever other language. There was a time in European history when the language was French. You didn't speak French, you weren't part of advanced society. Well, still true in Francophone areas, Africa, for example, or Haiti. But this is something that certainly can be achieved. And largely it's a matter of having reasons to do it.
Okay, thank you so much. And I cannot, when it comes to the role of motivation, especially for adults when they want to learn languages. And we have seen very successful cases, but as you mentioned also, it varies, you know. So Professor Chomsky, we have a few minutes left. I have two questions that I really wanted to ask you. One is about the debate which exists, you know, between a lot of people within the field of TESOL, ESL, when it comes to native speakers versus non-native speakers, and especially in terms of having native versus non-native teachers. And also the second question is about homeschooling. You know, since the pandemic, we have seen more people, more parents interested in not sending their kids to public schools, especially. So I wanted to get your thoughts on those two issues as well.
Well, let's take the second one. Public schools were basically an American innovation, mass public education of children, late 19th century, early 20th century. The United States was way ahead of the rest of the world. Also in publicly state universities and so on. It was a great advantage to the United States, helped it develop into the most advanced society in the world in many respects. Public education is not just what you learn. You live in a community. Like when my kids were little, we lived in a neighborhood. Kids walk to school together, get to know each other, they make friends, they visit each other's houses, they go to a neighbor's house for lunch on Saturday. Parents get to know each other, get joint interests. Pretty soon you have a community. Community can get together and say, let's get together and build a small community swimming pool. Kids will, it just, if you break up the community, have individual schooling, maybe the kids will do just as well in tests, but they'll miss a lot. They'll miss living in a live, functioning, democratic community with participation, like that town and that school in South Tucson that I mentioned, where the community gets revived. Well, I think that's a major achievement for democracy. You also meet diverse kids, different backgrounds, and so on. So I think there's a value in public education that cannot be measured by test results. But its parents have to make their own decision, you know, different criteria. On native versus non-native speakers, I mean, plainly, it's better to have a native speaker if the native speaker has the right educational values, training, and so on. I mean, no matter how well I might learn a second language, I'll never speak it like a native. It's just impossible.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Chomsky, and I would like to thank our audience from all around the world. It was an amazing lecture, and as usual, we enjoyed your comments on sociopolitical issues as well as language and education-related issues. So thank you so much, Professor Chomsky. Thank you so much, our audience, and see you in the next event.
My pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.